All right, we are live for the next Dr. Sadler's AMA, that is Ask Me Anything session. This is our session for December, and I've already got one question lined up for me, which I'll take in just a minute. Let me thank all my Patreon supporters for making this possible through their underwriting efforts, and I really enjoy these live interactions. I get a lot of good questions. Sometimes I get a few off-the-wall ones as well. And I should say from the start that I've already answered so many times lots and lots and lots of questions about Peterson and Harris and stuff like that. Sort of the pop philosophy people. I'm not going to go into that in any detail because I've already spent so much time discussing that sort of stuff. So I want to see what we've got in other good questions. So let's take Emil's question right off the bat. Have you read Hegel's Life of Jesus? Also, are there any other contemporary philosophers with serious yet non-traditional views on Christianity? So yeah, I read his Life of Jesus, which is a very early work of Hegel's. A lot of people don't realize that Hegel had writings before the phenomenology. He was working at his conceptions over and over and over again in time, and kind of working his ideas out. There's like a whole genre of life of Jesus sort of literature out there that in the late 18th and then early 20th century, early 19th century, all the way running into the 20th century, with what we call the quest for the historical Jesus materials. People have been engaging in you could call it non-traditional, although it's nowadays it's become its own sort of tradition. I mean, it's been around for 2 centuries. Takes on Jesus, and oftentimes they view him in as like a moralist who didn't get into all that religious stuff, or the opposite, he was an eschatological prophet, and then the early Christians made too much of him. So there's a lot of things out there like that, and you could say that the 19th century was almost obsessed with rethinking this Jesus fellow and coming up with new interpretations, but a lot of them run within more or less the same general currents. You could probably identify 5 or 6 of them. It's been a while since I've been looking at that material, although I used to teach a class for a long time when I was working for Ball State called Jesus and the Gospel Traditions, where we would talk a lot about different conceptions of that central figure. All right, a lot of questions pouring in. Daniel asks, have you had any students that were vocal supporters of scientism that challenged you? How have you dealt with this strange and wrong philosophical position? So let's say what scientism is to begin with. There's an older fashioned name for it. It's positivism. This notion that science, in the sense of the positive, generally physical, sometimes social sciences, would have the answers for everything. That's been around for about another 200 years as well. People have been saying the same sort of things. They just gussy it up with new approaches every so often. And the idea is that science, or the sciences, because there is no such thing as science, capital S. There are the sciences, and then there's our theorizing about what we're actually doing as we proceed with them. And then there's like science journalism, which is a whole different thing. That would be able to solve all the big problems in human life, and anything that can't be brought under the sort of domain of science, however you conceive of it, would not be a real problem, or would be pseudo ideas or something like that. So yeah, I've dealt with many students who have those sorts of views. Oftentimes it's because they haven't thought through things very well. One thing I often do is point them to genuine scientists, people who work within fields who were not themselves, scientifists, you could say, or you might call them fundamentalists, or whatever you want of secularism. And so that's one way I deal with it. Sometimes, if they're more sophisticated, it takes a bit more work. I ran into this quite a lot in the prison teaching. in part because there were, all these shows that these people would watch and books that would circulate around in there. Wesley Rutledge, what do you think about the solution of the one and many in Orthodox theology? I don't know that there is a solution of the one and many in Orthodox theology. I'd be interested to know what that one solution is. When I look through the Philokalia, I do not see anything remotely like that. But then again, I don't think there is one single thing called Orthodox theology out there. Patrick Radowick, your thoughts on Wisconsin state Republicans' actions of this past week. So we're going to get very political. I think it's abysmally horrible what they did. And I am disgusted with the GOP in this state. We used to have some decent, moderate, sort of like civically minded Republicans in this state, and I don't see many of them left. If there are some, they're keeping their mouth shut and their head down because the partisanship here is just incredible. And there's plenty of, Republicans who are very committed, but they are irrationally so. And the end run that they're making around the democratic process is so morally inconsistent that I find it disgusting. And as a registered independent, people like me are going to continue voting against the Republicans now, not just for the next election, but many elections to come until we see some come to Jesus moments on the part of the GOP where they start to say, yeah, this was really a stupid idea. We shouldn't have sold out our integrity, what there was left of it, for political gain. They really need to, either they're going to rethink things or they're going to implode. Demographically, they know that they're starting to lose, and they're not going to hold on to their power base no matter how much gerrymandering they do and how much packing courts. They're not going to hold on to it forever. And if they can't win in the realm of ideas, which Republicans were starting to do for a while back in the I'm not talking about the Tea Party people, though they were always kind of wackos in many respects, but I'm talking about a lot of other stuff happening in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. That's gone now. That's totally gutted, both because of what's been happening at the state level and because of the Trump administration, and it's metastasizing of the worst elements in the Republican Party. If they don't fix that, they're essentially within 20 years a dead party. And it'll be not because the Democrats and a blue wave will sweep them away. It'll be because of people like me disgusted with them and saying, this is cancer within democracy. So that's may sound like extreme views to people, but read about what's been going on in Wisconsin for the last several years, and then take a look at what just happened after the election. By the way, North Carolina, another place where I lived, equally bad when it comes to that sort of thing. All right, Memento Mori, which secondary sources would you recommend for a deeper understanding of Nietzsche for someone who's read his works? Well, there's a lot of great thinkers who have interesting things to say about Nietzsche. I mean, Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures are pretty cool. You're definitely getting a lot of Heidegger in that, right? But it's worth engaging with. Stanley Rosen has some good stuff on Nietzsche. Kaufman, of course, is an important person as an interlocutor. I used to be really, really into Kaufman, especially as a younger, I wouldn't even say scholar because I wasn't writing scholarly work at the time. I was a student at the time. Deleuze has a cool book on Nietzsche that I think is well worth reading. As a matter of fact, people have heard me bash Deleuze. I like Deleuze when he's doing his history of philosophy stuff. I like him when he's doing his stuff that's in essays, critique et clinique, however that's translated in English. Might be literally, it would be critical and clinical essays. And I think that when he's doing that sort of stuff, he's got very interesting things to say. Again, like with Heidegger, you're getting a lot more Deleuze than you're getting the thinker themselves, but there's a lot of interesting things along those lines. Let's see, Kondo Teoro, who are some other YouTubers that I watch? Regularly, almost nobody, because I don't have the time to do it. I'll tune into somebody's lecture here and there. I like some of the older stuff that's been out there for a long time. With people who I enjoy watching, where really they're taking stuff like from TV appearances and turning it into a YouTube video. I did recommend a colleague of mine, Christopher Annandale, recently, who is doing similar stuff to me. He sometimes he does little videos for his classes that are fairly short but very focused. They're not glitzy, glamoury. Here's some animations on Immanuel Kant, with a bouncy voice or something like that. He's just a philosophy professor explaining things in a competent way. And I like him doing that. So if you haven't checked him out, maybe you should go to him. Let's see. Zika Foose, could you speak about the use of vagueness or plausible deniability, leaving breadcrumbs in composition as it might relate to alt-right co-opting? So a lot of ideas mixed in there. Vagueness. So, okay, vagueness and plausible deniability. Let's bring up another term as well to make it more complicated. Ambiguity, right? So vagueness is when you're using terms that are hard to pin down because maybe there's a continuum or something like that. Ambiguity is when terms have several different meanings, like freedom, or justice. Aristotle, by the way, in book 5 of Nicomachean Ethics, begins it by saying justice is spoken of in multiple ways, and this is why people get into so many arguments about it. So when we're using terms like that, and generally we have to use terms like that if we're going to talk about anything that's particularly important, because the nature of our language and the way reality works. Now the plausible deniability. So I guess what you're talking about there is saying things that have a definite meaning, and then it allows you to back off from it if somebody starts challenging you on it. Sometimes we talk about this like in terms of dog whistles, right? And both the left and the right have their own dog whistles, by the way. Oftentimes people are surprised by the fact that others understand their code, and can figure out what they're saying and are shocked and upset with them for it. Now, breadcrumbs. Usually, when we talk about breadcrumbs, we're talking about leaving a trail that you can follow. I don't know about it in terms of composition. I'm used to hearing about it in terms of other things. But I suppose maybe if the idea is you leave a trail that can get you back to the places that you're going to. And then alt-right co-opting. So it might be helpful to think of some examples here. So recently there's been a lot of talk, it comes in waves, about alt-right co-opting of Stoicism. And, I'll go on record here as saying that most of the alt-right stuff that I've seen having to do with Stoicism has just the most superficial connections with it. They like the idea of like being tough Stoics, but they've never actually read any Cicero, or they've read a little bit of Epictetus, a little bit of Aurelius, a little bit of Seneca, and then ignored all the rest of the stuff. Because for the Stoics, there is no courage without justice and wisdom. And there is no justice without, a sort of universal cosmopolitanism that won't go for something like white, ethno-nationalism or anything like that. So it's just incompatible. And being kind of a, juice head dick is incompatible with being a Stoic, no matter, what distancing techniques you use or something that you might have culled out of Epictetus. It's incompatible with it. And so these people are not Stoics at all, but they'll weigh in on Stoic forums and get involved in discussions. And then maybe the breadcrumbing is like, you see, you just need to look at the links that they're citing or what they're doing, and you can figure out very quickly where they're coming from. So maybe that's what you had in mind. I don't know. But that's my best shot at that. All right. Daniel, do you think the Russia or Mueller's investigation will result in criminal charges against Trump or impeachment? I imagine they probably will. Now, how that'll actually play out, it's one thing you got to remember too. Impeachment requires both houses. Right now, the Republicans control the Senate, so he's not getting fully impeached any more than Clinton did under when the House impeached him and the Senate didn't impeach him. All right, Andrew Hooper, TLDR and Stoic Week report on well-being and Stoicism. I don't remember exactly what TLDR means because I more or less ignore acronyms like that, but I know it has something to do with shortening things. I don't want to give a little summary of it. I think that if you don't want to read it, don't read it. But I think that's a kind of laziness. It's a pretty short report. And it's good to read, and it's good to check that sort of stuff out. It has to do with the changes that people experienced in this Stoic attitudes and behavior scale, which Tim Laban and others have been perfecting over the last, I don't know, like 7 years or so. And that by itself is a really cool research artifact that you should check out. The basic takeaway from all these Stoic Week things that we're finding is it actually does make a difference on people's lives. And the more that you do it and the more consistently you do it, if you don't just do it for a week, but you do it as regular practice, it has a bigger effect. Big surprise, right? It's nice to have data to show that. Because then the people who are only data minded will actually believe you, but it's not something that we haven't known from ancient times onward, right? Here's a blast from the past question from Yasonas. What was your relationship with philosophy as a teenager? How did you end up going into a philosophy major? So my relationship with philosophy as a teenager was that I was interested in it without realizing that I was interested in it. I took a philosophy class in high school that really sucked because the teacher was terrible and we had a terrible textbook. Unless I'm misremembering, maybe my memories are too uncharitable, but I remember finding it dry as hell. And then I took another class with another teacher who was a substitute, and it wasn't even a philosophy class. It was supposed to be a religion class. But he started out teaching us a little bit about Augustine and said, yeah, in order to make sense of Augustine, I got to teach you some Plato and some Aristotle, no textbook, just lectures and discussion and talking about ideas. And then we talked about Augustine a lot. And then we talked about some Freud and Jung and Adler, believe it or not, by the end of that class. And I really loved that approach. He was probably one of the most important teachers I've encountered, and I don't even know his first name. I just knew him as Mr. Lorenzo. He was a substitute there for just one semester. One of the best teachers that my high school had, and they didn't retain him. And they held on to these other people instead who made the classes dry as dust. But there was that, and then I'd read bits of things here and there. I'd buy books at used bookstores. I knew somewhat about philosophy in part because I had such an interest in history. And then, of course, the first actual philosophy book I read was Camus' Mythosiphysicus, but I didn't understand 3/4 of what was in there. My uncle had it, and I borrowed it because I had an interest in Greek mythology, and I thought, well, that sounds like a cool book. And that would have been like I was maybe 14, 15 or so. And so my reading was kind of haphazard. And then I went in the Army, and I did, in fact, buy a philosophy book. It was sort of like, here's a summary of different philosophical questions, and I thought that was cool, and I learned a little bit with that. And then I got out and went to college, and my mom's boyfriend at the time had the advice that I should declare a major right away. And I looked down the list and I saw philosophy, and I was like, that sounds cool. I'll do that. And that's how I became a philosophy major. I just kept at it. Turns out there's a lot of cool stuff there. So Adam has a question here, which is not going to be easy to write in this. What's the difference between Hegel's and Heidegger's conception of truth? Isn't it the same? Well, I can answer that second part. No, it's not the same. To begin with, they don't have a conception of truth. Both of them are sophisticated enough that they understand that there's an entire history of conceptions of truth by the time that they get to it. and they sometimes have more than one working within their works at the same time. Heidegger, of course, is famous for bringing up truth as aletheia, or revealing, unveiling something that would be prior to, and always grounding truth as adequatio or correspondence between either idea or word and reality. Hegel, of course, is famous for saying, truth is in the system, and it's something that we often call the coherence theory of truth. But both of them are working with a lot of moving parts in their theories of truth, but they're not exactly the same. And complicating it further, Heidegger sees Hegel as one of the great metaphysicians in this epochal history of metaphysics, and he teaches about Hegel as well. So, Colin Graham is a much easier question for me. What's my favorite fast food restaurant? So, fast food, that's a good question. I would probably say, if I had to pick one, Five Guys, which is a hamburger and fries chain. Really good hamburgers, really good French fries. They have peanuts that you can eat at the table while you're waiting. Most fast food I don't eat anymore because it's really changed since when I was a kid. I remember when I was a kid, going out to McDonald's was like a real treat. We'd do it every once in a while. And back then, there was a lot more beef in the hamburgers than filler. And they also, cooked the fries in the tallow from the beef, which made them pretty awesome. And then, things changed, and they're always like constantly cutting corners. A lot of fast food, the meat in fast food is only a certain percentage meat, and it's not the good stuff. And they've been reducing prices year after year after year. Had a colleague who was just telling me, he's a grad student, and he shares an office with me, and he was saying like he and his gamer buddies were like getting together, and they thought about getting Chick-fil-A chicken nugget platter for their snacks, or they could go to McDonald's and order a bunch of chicken nuggets. And I said, well, I mean, that's not a bad idea, except that it's not really chicken. Do you really want to be eating that much of that stuff? So, yeah, things have really changed a lot since then. All right, Mrs. Snarky. Love Stoic philosophy, even though I don't agree with them entirely. I still find it useful and helpful. Yeah, me too. I don't identify as a Stoic, although I probably, use and agree with more Stoic principles and practices than many of the people who have recently become Stoics and claim to be all about Stoicism. But I don't buy the whole package, and I don't have to. I'm a philosophical eclectic. I take, like Cicero, I bring together what I find particularly useful. So for me, quite often that's from the Platonist, Aristotelian, Stoic traditions, some medieval Christian stuff, a lot of existentialist stuff, some dialectical things, some psychotherapeutic stuff, and I use it all together, right? To me, that sounds good. So, yeah, you don't have to like identify as a Stoic. All right, let's see what we have here. Retro Gamer, have a great burger and fries on Alex. Thanks, that's very nice of you. Yeah, we are fortunate in that we do have quite a few Five Guys around here. And maybe I'll do that on the way. I have to go see my kids down in Indiana on Monday. I'm going down for my son's Christmas concert, although they probably call it a holiday concert, I imagine. And so I'll be on a long drive, and there actually is a Five Guys on the way, and I have to get on the road around lunchtime, so maybe I'll do that. So thanks. That's very, very nice of you. Chip, what was Cicero's philosophical reputation in the Greek-speaking world? I don't think he had much of one. That's a great question. I mean, to figure that out, we would have to look at, well, actually, I can say that he was read for example, Jerome, one of the church fathers, around the same time as Augustine, he brings up Cicero. Jerome was one of the people who translated the Bible into Latin. So clearly he was being read, at least in Latin, by people in the Greek-speaking world. But I think because he wrote in Latin primarily, he wouldn't have had much of an effect, say, on like Byzantine philosophy, right? Or too many of the Eastern, church fathers who are writing and engaging with Greek philosophy. He really had a major effect on the Latin West, in part because his works were actually, at least some of them, kept and copied in the monasteries. But I don't think he had a big effect on the Greek-speaking world. Daniel Cox, are there any living philosophers you think will become canonical figures for later generations? Yeah, a few. Like within the utilitarian tradition, I think that Peter Singer is quite important in that respect, right? So we can say like Bentham, Mill, Sidgwick, and then there's a few other people that are much less known that were contributing to utilitarianism. And then I think Singer, is somebody who really took it seriously and tries to extend it to animal rights. Alistair McIntyre, definitely going to be read and talked about for centuries to come. Who else? There's a lot of really great contributors, just as there were in previous generations, to better understanding historical figures and keeping their thought alive. Like, you think about Julia Annas, for example, and her major contributions to understanding ancient philosophy in our own time. But I don't know that she's going to be read for her own sake. I think she'll be read more by those of us who want to see a brilliant mind at work digesting, what the Epicureans are up to over here, what the Aristotelians are up to over here. Anthony Long would be somebody like along the same lines, with respect to Hellenistic philosophy as well. Who else might be viewed as canonical figures later on? That's a good question. You think about the people who are really big stuff right now, most of them I don't think are going to stand the test of time. And you think even about like, let's say we take continental philosophy and you think about like the last 50 years or so, how many of those thinkers are going to be really read and used, not just mentioned. A lot of people mention Derrida, very few people actually read Derrida. And that's even right now. So that's a good question to think about. All right, Eric Metz, Lyndon LaRouche. Wow, I haven't heard about him for a long time. And his clique are hardcore anti-Aristotle. They say it's because he's an empiricist, that all knowledge comes from and through your senses. How true is this? Aristotle thinks that senses are very important, but he wasn't an empiricist in the sense that like the British empiricists were. LaRouche, I haven't heard of him for a long time. He's really far out there, he was just down the road in Illinois. I remember, when I was a kid, reading about him in Time magazine. And then, all the trouble he got in with the government. So, there's a lot of people who are like pro-Aristotle or anti-Aristotle for kind of the wrong reasons. And you read them and you're like, I don't think these people really read much Aristotle. I think they've read some textbooks talking about Aristotle or some secondary lit, but I don't think they spent much time with them. All right, Zaina. Hey, Dr. Sadler, I know a metal music fan. Are you in touch with Catatonia's Black Metal Doom? They're a Swedish band. What is your way of comparison between European metal and English metal? Well, when you're talking about like black metal or the other genre stuff, it's kind of a bit beyond what I got into. So I don't know what to say in response to that, because I don't know the band, and I can talk much more about like 1970s, 80s, even a bit of 90s stuff. But I don't know the gamut of all these other, bands that are out there. Let me scroll back up to, there's so many questions here to get to it. Okay. Way of comparison between European metal and English metal. That, I mean, if you're talking about like what's going on in the 70s and 80s, I can say that England was really sort of the hotbed for like what was going on in the metal scene. Think about like who were the huge bands, right? Coming out of it. Early on, you got, Black Sabbath, we can count Led Zeppelin. If we're going to count Led Zeppelin, we should definitely count Uriah Heep from the same time, Deep Purple. And Sabbath and Purple were really looked at early on as like the main people. You think about, Bruce Dickinson didn't model himself after Ozzy, modeled himself after Ian Gillan. And so you got like a continuity there. And then you got like bands like UFO and Hawkwind, right? Now, UFO, of course, brings on a German guitarist. They steal Michael Schenkner from the Scorpions. But you don't have that much metal stuff going on in Europe, in those formative years. And then it starts to develop, and you get quite a few bands coming out of the European scene, starting in late 70s, early 80s. Only a few of them really make it. I mean, you could talk about the Scorpions as a major success. Accept as well. Crocus, although they were never that good, unfortunately. Then you get a whole bunch of other bands like Halloween, and there's a few French ones, but it's mostly German driven. And then things start moving up into the Scandinavia. I will mention Oz as a 1980s Finnish band that's really good. Yeah, and so you've got that stuff going on, and then of course you've got two American scenes, West Coast and East Coast, going on at the same time, and they all kind of blend into each other and reinforce each other. Are there stylistic differences? I think you can say that there are, but people are borrowing from each other a lot. And of course you're going around. If you're a band that's actually touring, you're going from place to place to place to place to place, right? And so you're bringing that, and of course albums would go from place to place as well. So yeah, we should probably actually do like a session sometime just specifically on metal. All right, Christianus writes, what is getting a doctorate in philosophy like? Very time consuming. You got to put up with a lot of people's BS who in the long run don't really matter. And you probably make a lot of mistakes along the way. But it's very different from place to place to place. It's not possible to generalize about it too much. Mrs. Snarky, there's folks who consider Jesus as a mythical figure. Yeah, the mythicists. I don't take them seriously because that sort of stuff's been around for a long time. Again, when you're a historian of ideas, you see people coming out, and this kind of goes to that question Daniel's asking there about having your mind blown. I very infrequently get my mind blown because people bring out ideas and they're like, this changes everything, and you're like, no, it doesn't. Jesus, you're just doing what these people did in the 1920s, and you got different language for it, and you probably didn't even read them, so you're just replicating their stuff. It's interesting if you look at it sort of cross-culturally. There's people, Socrates was not a historical figure. Confucius was not a historical figure. The Buddha was not a historical figure, blah, 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 right? And the problem is that there isn't, if you go to the canonical text, they by themselves, yeah, that's all you've really got. But the arguments for them being a mythical figure are just as crappy as any other arguments, and people do a lot of wishful thinking. I'm always interested to see what psychological, charge people get out of taking these I'm in the know kind of positions. So yeah. Harris, what does Heidegger think of St. Thomas Aquinas? Does he write anything about him? Yeah, he talks about him plenty. Aquinas sort of represents the pinnacle of a particular metaphysical commitment that happens once you start thinking about things in a Christian perspective. You think about God as the being of beings, right? And he brings them up quite frequently. Aquinas also is one of the main articulators of truth as adequation between idea or word and reality. So yeah. Let's see here. Bruno, any philosophers that write at length about nature, trees, birds, etc., other than Thoreau, Emerson, and Rousseau? Well, Aristotle, and his successor Theophrastus, they wrote a lot about nature. They dedicated entire books to them. It was sort of a common theme to discuss in the Romantic period as well, and I think there's quite a few philosophers out there today who are very interested in the natural world as well. Jared, have you read any Ibn Rushd, Averroes? If so, what do you think of his ideas on the attributes of God? It's been a long time since I read Averroes. I read him in grad school, and then I read him again when I was like putting together stuff for my philosophy of religion classes. But it's been too long since I've been dipping into him for me to have much to say about him. Patrick Sherlock, is there a recommended way to follow your half-hour Hegel series? Should I read the phenomenology in its entirety first and watch your series, or just follow along? There isn't a recommended way. They're designed to be a tool that can help you out. If you want to read the book first, it's going to take you a while. It's a difficult work, and then watch the videos after that. That's fine. Or if you want to, what I would probably say is, if you're going to follow along with it, pick out here I'm going to do work on this section for this month, and I'm going to watch these videos and read this stuff. I would say expect to read and reread, because Hegel is really tough stuff. I mean, I'm rereading over and over again just to prep for these little sessions, and I've been reading Hegel for like 20 years, maybe more. So yeah. Really, BK, what do I read when I want to learn to be a better dad? Now, what do I personally read? I read philosophical stuff, and occasionally blog posts, from people talking about fatherhood. What would you want to read? I don't know. There's probably a whole literature out there about fatherhood that would be quite good. I just don't really read that stuff. Sometimes I'll find it useful to talk with other dads about things. I'm fortunate in that I've one of my dads, my adopted dad, is long dead, but I've got my birth father who I'm in contact with, so I can bounce ideas off of him some of the time. But a lot of the time his answers are sort of, well, you do your best. So it's just nice sometimes to have somebody to talk to. Daniel asked, do I support the recreational legalization of marijuana? Yeah, I think that the time has come to take that off of the law things. And I think a lot of people are against that because they like profiting on the misery that drug busts provide them with. It doesn't mean I'm thinking that we should make all drugs legal. Let's have some PCP as well. No, some of that stuff we need to keep under wraps. But marijuana, yeah. Nicola wanted to ask about Parmenides and Plato's being. What did you want to ask about it? Maybe that answer will be further down. Equin, what aspects of Plato do you find congenial in your own thinking? That's a good question. I like the tripartite understanding of the human psyche. I don't buy into like a very rigid faculty psychology, but I think there's something to that. And I think that thumatic part is very important to attend to. I don't know that I think that there's anything out there like forms, but I think that thinking in terms of the forms can often be quite helpful as a heuristic. And what else? The movement from the body to the soul provided, sort of like in the symposium, when we're not just devaluing the body, that's kind of good stuff. Although I don't like so much where it leads after that to the impersonal. I'm really a personalist when it comes down to things. And I just really love reading Plato. I don't know that I actually take that much from him directly in terms of, well, Plato said this. I will say this, the notion that there is no perfect justice within this world, and yet we can conceptualize justice, that's a good one, right? That every justice that we look at in this world, or courage or whatever, is always going to have some side we can look at it from where it's not just. That seems important to me. AP and the birth of tragedy. What does Nietzsche mean by the statement the world is only justified in as an aesthetic phenomenon? It means it's not justified in a moral sense, or in other ways. It would have to do with our aesthetic responses to the world, so that it would be how we experience the world in terms of things like the interesting, or the beautiful, or the sublime, or the really is the horrifying an aesthetic response, perhaps, that would fit in there. And the Apollonian and Dionysiac responses are both aesthetic responses, as well as ways of living, ways of approaching things. Corbeau, should we care about the racist views of philosopher like Kant and Locke? This is a good question too. Yeah, we should care about it, but we should care about it in the following way. We should, just like we should care about what Aristotle thinks about women too, which is equally boneheaded. We should say these philosophers say some things that are clearly wrong, and they could have possibly known better if the situation had been better. They'd chosen to think in different ways. But we don't throw out the rest of their work because of it, unless it's directly tied to the racism. So, like, when you read Kant's Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, plenty of racism in there, right? Does that impact his critique of practical reason? I don't think so. When Hegel, for example, tells us that Africa has no history, Hegel's wrong, and that might be a bit more damning, right? Because everything is tied together in Hegel. When Aristotle tells us that women are, just biologically and intellectually inferior to men, Aristotle is wrong, and we should set aside or ignore or use Aristotle's own work in a way against him. By the way, that's what deconstruction in the real sense is. If you read Derrida, you take an author seriously. It's similar. I actually wrote a piece years back where I showed Derrida's notion of deconstruction is similar to Maurice Blondel's approach in philosophy. The extending charity to your opponents. That's the sort of thing I would say we got to do. All right, Mrs. Snarky, the GOP can no longer claim to be the party of morals. Yeah, they're really reaching a crisis point where, for a long time they were all about like family values and, they're religious conservatives. You really have to go through a lot of mental gyrations if you are a committed, religious believer to map that onto the rest of the GOP platform. And people are able to do that because people can have all sorts of contradictory ideas in their head at the same time, but that's no way to live, and it's one thing if you have your own, like it says in Tristram Shandy, any man can ride his hobby horse as far as he wants along the King's Highway, so long as he does not compel me to get on. And that's unfortunately what politics is forcing other people to get on, for better or for worse. So it's one thing if you've got all sorts of cognitive dissonance between genuine moral life and what the party demands, and it's another thing when you're imposing that through policy on other people, particularly the most poor and vulnerable. The sheer mean-spiritedness of so many Republicans these days, I find really troubling. Not to say that the Democrats don't get a pass on that. I mean, there's plenty of Democrats who are equally problematic. But the GOP right now seems to me the bigger problem. Chip, in a video about getting your PhD, you talked about picking Hegel as your special thinker. This was at Southern Illinois University, right? We had to take 4 preliminary examinations. It was a very rough, rigorous exercise that has been, since gotten rid of. Most places didn't have anything that rigorous, by the way. And I had to pick Hegel. I had to pick one person as my special thinker, so I picked Hegel. And I was told, what should I do to prep for this? Memorize the phenomenology and all the dialectics inside of it. And, the important parts of the science of logic, too. So I did. Did anybody have their special thinker rejected? I don't know. I never heard of that happening, but I think if you picked somebody who was kind of off the wall, not really a philosopher, maybe they would have rejected it. Or if you couldn't put together a committee that could actually test somebody on it, maybe that would have been the issue. Like I couldn't have done Blondel as my special thinker because I only had one professor who actually had read Blondel's works. So, yeah. All right. I answered the question about the Mueller stuff already. Wonder Lady, question, can we improve the DNC? Yeah, there's a lot of ways the DNC could be improved. Getting rid of most of the current crop of insiders, which isn't going to happen, would be one great way to do it. So it would actually be a representative Democratic Party, not beholden to all these friggin' special interests, making them look just as bad as the Republicans. The Democrats lose when the Democrats don't provide a viable, not just viable, but believable alternative to the Republicans. And, they seem to manage to screw it up each cycle, don't they? So, yeah, there's lots of ways. Man of action, you're quite right about the GOP. I'm conservative and think the same. Yeah, I think I probably would be considered conservative in many respects, but I think conservative now has lost its meaning for most of these people in the Republican Party. They're not conservative. They're not actually like retaining anything good. They just want to like keep certain class structures and in place and make them even more deeply regressive. And they want to keep some of them want to keep hold on to sort of racist agendas. There's very little like worry about the common good. It used to be conservatives actually gave a shit about the environment. Now they're like, let's screw it all up as much as we can. None of this climate change stuff exists. And you're like, what is wrong with you people? Conservatives of, 40, 50 years ago would be looking at you and just throwing up. But that's where we are. So, all right. Austin, are you familiar with Paul Valéry's dialogues? He uses Socratic dialogue to discuss the role of art, the artist, and beauty. No, I wasn't. And I'm teaching a ethics for artists and designers next semester at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. So that may be a very useful takeaway for me from this session, Paul Valéry's dialogues. I'll check that out because I haven't put together my list of readings for that class. It's I've taught a lot of professional ethics classes, but I've never done one just for artists and designers. So we're spending some time, like what's utilitarianism, what's, deontological approaches, what's virtue ethics, and doing some application stuff. Okay, what virtues does an artist need, but then we'll do a lot of stuff specifically on the nature of art and beauty and its value. Adam, are you past all of your philosophical phases? Yeah, probably, because I'm not like super committed to any one single thing anymore like I used to be, right? I have the kind of personality, or at least I did in the past, where I was a real, join the movement, I'm totally all in kind of person. I don't know that I'm like that anymore. So I may have exhausted my philosophical phases time. TK, how do you overcome writer's block? It hasn't been an issue for a long time because I haven't had the time to write. Now it's more a matter of actually carving out the time to do the writing stuff that I need to do. But in the past, sometimes like taking your mind off of it by going to do something else, can help. Going and working out. You let ideas kind of ferment for a while. And then sometimes you just got to like sit down and do the exercise of writing on a page. I have writer's block. And you can say to yourself, well, at least I wrote for an hour. And then eventually you hopefully come out of it. I will say, I think a lot of writer's block for many people comes out of a sort of perfectionist worry, right? My writing isn't good enough. They're like engaging in self criticism while they're trying to write. They're overcome by like, well, should I write about this first or this first or this first? And I'm not saying this to make anybody feel bad or judged, but that can be a real impediment. So if you're feeling that way, you can tell yourself when your self is saying those sort of things to you, hey, you're full of crap. This is counterproductive. I know it doesn't feel that way, but this really is. And then just make yourself do some writing. What do I think of Simone Weil? An interesting philosopher, practiced what she preached. I'm not really a major, reader of her, but I know some people who are, and she's interesting. Andras Miklos Toth, please tell us your thoughts on free will versus determinism and compatibilism. I feel this is one of the most important for any philosophical system. Yeah, I think it's an important one too. I am a compatibilist. I think that there is a causal determinism, a vast causal nexus, but I also think that we make contributions within it. I think that free will is a term, like I was mentioning earlier with the question about vagueness. It's an ambiguous term. A lot of people often mean by it things that philosophers don't mean by it. And many of the opponents of free will say, well, science shows there's no free will. They have something very, very different in mind than what the proponents of free will mean, which is that we actually do, in fact, have some degree of freedom and choice. It could be that we have like a little window and we choose, and then it all goes back into this universal determinism where we've made now a contribution to it. And it sort of recoalesces around it and systematizes itself around it. But then we've made a difference. We have been self-movers in Aristotle's sense. I think what's important is figuring out the ways in which determinism and freedom come together. That's what I'm much more interested in. All right. O2, have you read Alexander Kojève? What's your thought on his introduction to Hegel? Yeah, I've read Kojève, and I've read other works by Kojève as well, because I think he's an interesting guy. I wouldn't rely on his introduction to Hegel as your sort of like your introduction to Hegel. I would say that among his contemporaries, Jean Hippolyte and Eric Weil would be closer to the text and closer to Hegel than Hippolyte is. Hippolyte is like I mentioned like Heidegger and Deleuze earlier on in this. You're getting way more Hippolyte than you are getting the person he's writing about. But it's not going to kill you to read him, right? He's certainly somebody worth reading. He by the way, was somebody important in the early formation of what eventually became the European Union. And he's coming from a sort of, Hegelian perspective. He thought that was an important project. Lubomir, what should one do when experiencing difficulty reading source text, let's say the Nicomachean Ethics? Can you recommend any introductory books that help out with Aristotle and Plato ideas? I can't, because I don't usually recommend introductory books. I don't read any introductory books. What I do and when I'm teaching these things for my students, who, by the way, have no philosophy background usually, is I have them read the text and we talk about it, make some explanations and applications. I provide them with sort of these lesson pages that are like, blog posts, handouts, videos, resources to help them. And I tell them, I give them a little pep talk every semester. You are capable of understanding Plato and Aristotle if you apply yourself. It will be tough. So when you run into stuff that's difficult, keep at it. You're going to have to read and reread, and that's A-okay. And if you come away only understanding 1/3 of the concepts after 5 reads, that's fine too. People read and reread these thinkers for decades. I have been. And so, I don't think that there's nothing wrong with going to secondary sources. It's not going to hurt you. Just don't believe that the secondary source is necessarily the same thing as the original. The original is much richer, and it's worth spending time with. Chip, what do you think of Anthony Kenny? I remember you criticizing his translations of Aquinas. What do you think of his own philosophical writings? I think his book on Aristotle and the Will, it's okay. It's worth reading. I don't think he's right about a lot of stuff. I haven't read his History of Philosophy, which people said is pretty good, but I don't spend a lot of time reading, like I said, secondary stuff. So, Kennedy was a guy who did the stuff that he did fairly well, but I don't think he had a wide. I don't think he was able to sort of put himself into other perspectives very well. In the beginning, who was a better psychologist in your opinion, Shakespeare or Nietzsche? Probably Shakespeare, although I think they're doing very different things. You could also ask, well, how about Dostoevsky? Who's better, Dostoevsky or Shakespeare? I don't know, maybe Dostoevsky. It really depends on what you're looking for, I would say Shakespeare has a much wider range, but what are we going to do? Give out a prize or something to these guys? Aka, maybe? I'm not sure how that little circle thing above the A changes the vowel. Can you please elaborate on the topic of what reality really is? No, I can't do that. What concept of reality has Hegel compared to Heidegger? Well, I mean, Hegel uses the term real, wirklich, all the time, but that's not necessarily what you have in mind by reality. I think it is a vast totality of things. And no, I can't do anything with that here. So, yeah. Giovanna, are you familiar with Angie House from the University of Sheffield? She doesn't have a channel, but you can find lectures from her on YouTube. Yeah, I'm familiar with her. She's a kind of a name in public philosophy. It's nice to have a good platform and people to video record you and do all that stuff for you. That's been helpful. Her work seems to be pretty good, and that's really about it. Missus, lots of dog whistles being used on the right. They keep altering them to make the left look crazy. Yeah, there's this whole this whole thing about owning the libs, that again, don't really understand. But anybody who spends a lot of time doing that is basically ruining their character. That's a virtue ethics perspective on that sort of thing. Joe, what do you think Hegel would say to Marx about the relationship between history and philosophy? That's an interesting question. What would Hegel say to Marx, period? I think Hegel would say, well, it's less driven by economics than you make it out, but nice job on the economics front. You've really gone much further than I have in your analyses of things. And I think Hegel would probably look at Marx's analysis of what capitalism does and how it developed and how it brought itself to the table. And he'd probably be like, yeah, I can buy your stuff on this. Nice job. He'd probably look at Marx as being like the way Aristotle look at Theophrastus. All right. Oh, okay. Zika Foose has a thing about Zena Bash using the OK symbol. Yeah, here I'm going to have a little rant. One of the things I like, one of the things I dislike the most, I'm going to say like the least, but no, I don't even like it. I dislike it about all these people who are, have their little covert agendas and stuff like that, is how they're screwing up they're screwing things up for the rest of us, right? I mean, I'd like to be able to make the OK symbol without somebody thinking that I'm, flashing a white power sign. But those jackasses had to do their little secret club and all of that, and then they screwed up for the rest of us. And there's so many things like that. And the right has done plenty of that. The left has also done plenty of that too, with seeing racism everywhere. And I wish people would sometimes just shut the hell up and get the hell out of our public space. If they want to do their silly bullshit, their bullshit. So yeah, I mean, there's all this in crowd kind of stuff. I've never been a joiner in that sense. I may have said I could be like a movement person, but it had to be a movement that I'd believe in. And as soon as I'd realized that most of the members were full of crap, I'd quit being part of that movement. So, all right. Adam, do you think people need religious guidance? Or are we doomed to live in absurdity? I think that the way the world, that's a good question. The way the world is, it's very easy to draw conclusions that it's an absurd world. But that's not the only way that we can look at it. There's other alternatives possible, I would say. Sometimes they require a kind of support structure or apparatus, conceptually, emotionally, pragmatically, in terms of stories and in terms of connections to other people. And religion can provide that. Religion often doesn't provide that for people, though, because it winds up being co-opted in one way or another. I was talking about like these people in the GOP who are religious, and you're like, how does this jibe with anything that you actually believe or your church teaches? Or, like maybe the Sermon on the Mount might have to say, and they have to do so much backpedaling. And that's possible with any religious framework, and it's possible with philosophical frameworks. People, like I mentioned, people using Stoicism for all sorts of stuff. I bash the alt-righters. There's another thing where we call it Stoicism with a $sign for the S, and that's the people who are all like, Stoicism is about life hacks for productivity. Let me sell you my 20-step book with a few quotes from Marcus Aurelius and then a bunch of watered-down pop psychology stuff. You can do that with it as well. So I don't see these as, I see that as all like on one big continuum when it comes to these structures. Do we need religious guidance? We probably need something that fulfills that role. It's interesting. A lot of people would get worked up about the sacrament of confession in the Catholic Church. Well, who are you to tell us that we have to confess? Well, as it turns out, telling people about your bullshit is actually quite helpful for you. And there's people now proposing that we need a secular version of that. And we've had a secular version of it. It's called psychotherapy. These sorts of things can be quite useful, perhaps without a religious structure to them. Maybe you get more out of it if there's a religious structure. Like if you're going to do mindfulness, and you're going to use sort of stuff from Buddhism that's been stripped down and turned into just kind of a little mishmash of talking softly and centering yourself. You're probably going to get more out of it if you actually go back to Buddha's mindfulness, or Hindu equivalents of that in yoga, or Stoic prosoche, or other things. But maybe those are good gateway drugs for people. All right. John, I'm one of your $1 patrons. Please make more half-hour Hegel videos so I can give you more dollars. Well, I'm in the process. The last 4 months have been very tough, in terms of getting videos done. Hegel videos are very tough to do because they require a lot of thought on my part to be in the proper frame of mind. It's easier to talk about, say, Augustine or Pascal or Cicero or Aristotle for me than it is to talk about Hegel intelligently. And I don't want to produce a crap product, because that stuff's going to be out there for a long time. But I'm hoping to do the 6 this month. And thanks for your contribution. Philosopher, do you think ethnic groups have a right to see that their people continue to exist in the future, even if there's apparently no benefit in preserving their rights, for example, the declining white population? Well, I mean, I don't think the white population is in any danger of going away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, if you think about, if we wanted to like follow along the lines of the people who are often like, all worried about white genocide and some of the other baggage that goes with it, like, inferior mentality, most of those people tend to be pretty dumb themselves. And maybe, if all of us whites were going to like have a contest about like who would survive on, maybe they could be the surplus that gets lost, all the racists, and white ethnostaters. I don't find a lot of particularly, intellectually or morally gifted people among them. Do ethnic groups have a right to see their people continue to exist in the future? I don't know. if there is a right, I mean, you're talking about like a right that would belong to the group, right? Rather than belonging to the members. Depends on what's defining that group. I mean, I think the notion of whiteness is stupid anyway. I think it's done way more harm than good. And although census category white, I've never like said I identify with the white race or anything like that, for a variety of reasons. My biological great grandfather was Irish, had his horse farm completely destroyed by the Klan on one Christmas Eve here in Wisconsin, because remember the Klan hated Jews and Catholics as much as they hated blacks, right? Didn't help him to be white then, did it? And we can go on and on and on. Being from my adopted mother's side, French Canadian, are you really white in the same way as an Anglo is? Some respects yes, some respects no. In some respects you have more in common with other Latinos. But you can go on and on and on and on and on with that sort of thing. So no, I don't see. I mean, if you want a race to continue, focus on the members and make them people worth continuing on in their existence. If you asked me, if all whites were just a bunch of rabid racists, like let's say they're all, here's the thing I'm particularly against, especially up here in Wisconsin. Let's say they're all like super Confederate flag wavers, and they're the only members of the race. Well, I don't think the race has to continue then. As a matter of fact, I'd rather see them not, So a little bit of a rant there. All right. Cool Catson, what are your opinions on hierarchy? I think hierarchy often exists. I think that people that like hierarchy for its own sake are often pretty damaged, and they should ask themselves why they love hierarchy so much. I can't really answer the question about favorite philosopher because I don't have a favorite philosopher any more than I have a favorite band. Okay, let's go down. Let's see. Adriaro, what do you think of the Honduran refugees and Trump's draconian attitude? Are they dangerous zombies from The Walking Dead? No, I think they're just people who are stuck in a very shitty situation, and we're making things much more difficult for them, much more difficult than they need to be or ought to be. And I think exploiting them for political gain is, in the way that the Republicans have done, is pretty disgusting. I don't think that we should say, oh, well, everybody's automatically a refugee or anything like that. Maybe we should, like check them out. But all this punitive attitudes towards them, it's just, it's interesting because there's this whole debate about people who are like, that's not who we are as America. And then, all sorts of people who are minorities weighed in and said, well, if you know your American history, that is how we've been as Americans. And actually, you could read de Tocqueville, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, written in the 40s, right? Says that America has, for the most part, done pretty good, but it's treated two races horribly. And he writes about, at that time, the Native Americans and Africans who were brought here as slaves, right? So it's not as if this is a totally new thing, but it's a bad thing. Reigning Chief, opinions on Alan Watts. People ask me this all the time. I'm not, I read him when I was a kid, thought he was cool back then. Not a big fan now. Retro Gamer, should the Gilets Jaunes go home or press for the 6e Republique? Should there be a genuine revolution that sweeps away the current French establishment and ushers in a new presidency with a new de Gaulle or something like that? Very interesting question. I don't have an opinion on whether they should go home because France is not my country. So I think that they've, France has some really, really serious class problems. And a lot of that does center around the Paris versus everybody else thing. I'll tell you that's been around for a very long time. And I've seen that play itself out with my French friends and, with family members going over there, and sometimes even talking with Parisian French over here who look at me like I'm stupid when I ask where they're from, because obviously they're part of the elite. So where else could they be from, except for Paris? I think the Gilets jaunes are what's going on there is going on there because France's social contract, you might say, is radically damaged and needs to be fixed. So, yeah. All right. The new Stoics: well-being and virtue ethics is not well connected. Virtue is its own reward. I don't think so. I mean, depends on what you consider well-being to be. If you're an actual Stoic, you think that well-being and virtue are in fact almost identical. So just read your Cicero, read your Epictetus, or you wouldn't say that sort of thing. If we're talking about well-being in terms of other measures of well-being, again, read your Cicero, read your On the Ends, book 3, where Cato's presenting all of those things that are not themselves virtue, but are indeed preferred indifference, but do matter. I think you're adopting the Cynic view rather than the Stoic view there. So, all right, Brian, what do you think of Zizek's assertion that idealists are now materialists? I'd assume it's tied in with his materialist rereading of Hegel. I don't remember what the point was that he was making. He said stuff like that more than once, but I can't really say much about that. Wonder Lady, am I wrong to think logic is math? Logic is connected with math if you're talking about formal logic. If you're talking about logic in a broader sense, no. Whether we're talking about Aristotelian syllogistic logic, which is actually only part of what Aristotle means by syllogism, there's a whole story there to say, or whether we're talking about, other types of logic like Maurice Blondel's concrete logic or Hegel's logic or stuff like that. Math is only part of it. But, if you're doing formal logic, they're connected together, definitely. Mimi Caddy, does non-classical logic really matter? Yeah, it all matters. Right? It's all worth studying if you have the time. Chip, do you get many students who had decent experiences with philosophy in high school classrooms? No. I have a few students from time to time who had philosophy classes. They almost always sucked. They almost always didn't learn much. It's interesting. Even the ones who had philosophy classes in college, when they come into my other classes, very often have not retained much of what they studied. So I'm teaching this business ethics class this semester that's just finishing up. And at the beginning of the semester, these are the Marquette students, right? They're supposed to have had philosophy of human nature, which is like an intro class essentially, but it has ethics components. And then they have to take an ethics class. So they've taken 2 philosophy classes, one specifically on ethics. 90% of the class could not tell me anything about ethics at all in the business ethics class, even though they'd only been out of these classes for about a year, which means that whatever they were learning was not sticking with them. So there was clearly a failure on the part of the curriculum and the instructors. So, yeah. All right. Mrs. Snarky, sometimes the influence from one person, even for a short period of time, can be encouraging enough to impact an individual for life. We're talking about teachers. Yeah. And sometimes it can even be other people. Like I remember, and I apologize for the crudeness of this, but I remember when I was, a ward of the court, because I'd misbehaved so much, that my mother had filed an uncontrollability petition against me, and I was living in shelter care. I remember one of the staff members, when I was upset because he didn't want to talk to me, saying, act like an asshole, get treated like an asshole. And that was the right moment for me to actually hear the message. That made an impact on me. I still, by the way, remember my high school gym coach. Now, this is something he didn't say once. He said it over and over again. Don't cheat yourself. He'd talk about exercise. Like, he was also the track coach. We were tempted to kind of, towards the end of a run, not run quite as hard or fast. And he'd say, don't cheat yourself. You're only cheating yourself. And when I go to the gym and I work out and I'm tempted, I'm on a set of 12 and it's the 3rd set and I'm getting really, I'd like to like give in and kind of not push it all the way, but count it as a rep. I remember him saying that, and that made a difference for me. All right, in New Stoics in America, I wasn't taught philosophy in high school. Yeah, we don't have a national curriculum for philosophy. Many people get it if they go to a Catholic or sometimes Lutheran or sometimes other religious schools. You have a philosophy elective. If you're a rich kid in a really nice school, a public school, you might get it as well because it will be taught as a social studies elective. It's pretty rare that you find it in other places, unfortunately. Kyle, are you familiar with James George Fraser's Golden Bough? What's your take on Christianity as just another myth like any other? Is there something distinctive that sets it apart? Yeah, I mean, I read the Golden Bough years and years and years and years and years ago because I thought it's important. Everyone's referencing it. I probably should check it out. Then what do I think about it? It's okay. Do I think Christianity is a myth like any other? I would say right there that's already a problem because when you're talking about a religious complex as complicated as Christianity, it can't be a myth, right? There has to be a whole bunch of things. Even if we want to say it's all just myths, there'd have to be a whole bunch of different things. And then they're connected with material correlates, right? Practices, institutions, stuff like that. So I think a lot of that comparative stuff is often kind of weak, and I don't know. I don't remember being super impressed with the Golden Bough when I read it. All right, let me see. Everything just kind of skipped for a second. Mobile 2. This is a good question. What philosophers and concepts do you believe are essentials to learn before going deep into phenomenology? Depends on whose phenomenology you're studying. And by the way, I should mention there's things that are phenomenology without being called phenomenology. Henri Bergson's, focus on the immediate data of consciousness, phenomenology, essentially. Maurice Blondel's method of immanence, phenomenology, just not called phenomenology. It's generally good to have a good background in the history of philosophy. So you need to know some Plato, some Aristotle. You probably want to know your modern philosophy, since a lot of these people are referring to that. It really depends on who we're looking at. If you're asking about Husserl, I would say one group of people. If you're asking about Max Scheler, who's equally important as Husserl, different groups. Like you need to read some Augustine if you want to understand Scheler well, but you don't need to read him for Husserl. All right, Mrs. I'm glad there's people like us educating others on philosophy with dedication. Thanks. That's very nice. All right, let me scroll down. There's a lot of chitter chatter back between people. Mimi asks a very funny hypothetical question. If there was war between Kant's metaphysics and ancient metaphysics, who would get more beating? I don't know. I don't know how we personify metaphysics, and what are they fighting with? I think Kant is doing something quite interesting, but there's no internal necessity to accepting Kant's position. Amal, what is your preferred form of government? Monarchy, democracy, anarchy, oligarchy? My preferred form of government is one that actually works for the common good and doesn't become corrupt, has a good bit of representation and places for people who want to be involved, the chance to get involved. People are not, precluded from government because of class or race or gender or things along those lines, restricting them, keeping them out. That's what I would say. And what I'm saying is kind of along the lines of what Aristotle is laying out in Politics. Was it book 6 or 7? We need people who are actually, we don't just need the poor and the rich, right? We don't just need to represent a bunch of people's private interests, or private interests aggregated into one kind of public interest. We need people who actually care and think about the common good, and who try to remain honest, and who try to cultivate virtue, and don't just make a mess out of their hypocrisy. That's probably tough to bring about. L. Sarhan, just joining in, wanted to say thanks for being a better educator than my current philosophy professor. I wouldn't make it through this term without you. Well, that's nice. You guys know how I feel about many of my colleagues. I think the teacherly aspect to much of academics is downplayed quite a bit, and many people are not very good teachers, unfortunately, and they should work on that. All right, Montana. Why should a person not commit suicide and end suffering? Well, I mean, one argument right there is, sure, you can end your suffering, and then there's no more you that's suffering. Is your life entirely suffering, or is there anything good about it? Another thing to keep in mind: are you leaving anybody behind who's going to suffer because you decided to withdraw? Those are all some important considerations. L. Sarhan, are you going to do any videos on the argument for and against the concept of free will? Yeah, I've done some, here and there, but I don't usually do like topic things where it's just the concept of this or that. I'm usually focusing on a particular author who's talking about it. All right. John, any thoughts on current opinions in the philosophy of mind? I don't really follow analytic philosophy of mind much, so I don't know what the current opinions would be these days. Let me scroll down. We're at the 21 minute or hour and 20 minutes. We have a lot of things here, so I'm going to sort of pick just a few of them to answer. Kino, do you think someone like Derrida just kind of arrives at dead ends since it can't build up ethical or moral positions? He spent the last third of his career actually doing that in books like Aporias and Gift of Death and Spectres of Marx and, all of that stuff. He once he got out of his sort of freewheeling, which I thought was actually terrible stuff, middle phase, he started taking ethics and religion very seriously, and I've actually got some writings out there on that. Let's see here. Retro Gamer saw Hawkwind live. That would be very cool. Brian, here's a great question. How do you keep up with all the reading you have to do along with your busy schedule? Do you have a specific schedule you commit for reading every day? I don't. I mean, I'm sort of like somebody who's living on a vast bank account that I built up much earlier. I don't get the time for reading like I would like to. I mean, ideally, I would get to, put in like 4 or 5 hours a day reading. I'm lucky now if I get to spend, 2 hours, and oftentimes that's prepping for the classes that I'm teaching or the projects that I'm working on. Sometimes I'll take a day off. It's usually when I'm sick, and then, just read, right? All right. Let me scroll down a bit. Okay. I haven't heard you talk much about Habermas. That's Jürgen Habermas. He's written about a lot of subjects. What's your take on him? Habermas is an interesting guy. One of the things that's particularly interesting about him is that for somebody who's committed to, dialogue and speech, he kind of overwhelms people with how much he actually writes and publishes, making it difficult to engage him. Habermas is somebody who I've studied and who I've helped other people with, with dissertation research. I like him. He's a genuine. That's a good point. People had asked about like who will be canonical philosophers later on down the line. I think Habermas is going to be remembered. He's made a lot of important contributions. So, yeah. Ken, Dr. Sadler, I want to go back to school and pursue philosophy as a major. Where do I begin and what can I expect? What can you expect depends totally on the institution. I would do a lot of research on the institutions that you're interested in going to, because the way philosophy can be taught and done it varies incredibly from place to place to place to place. And find out from the students. Maybe go to their philosophy club meetings. Go see some events there as well. Talk to some of the professors. That's important. Going back to school and pursuing philosophy as a major, that's a matter of getting into school and then declaring that major. But you want to pick a place where you're going to get the kind of thing that'll work for you. All right. Let's see. So Robert asks, does Greg answer in this chat, or only the patrons? And then a couple other things. I take the stuff that comes in first, and there's usually a lot of that, and then I take the stuff that comes later. And I don't answer. Most of the people in here aren't people who are Patreon supporters. As a matter of fact, I'm willing to bet half of them don't even know I have a Patreon. So, all right. Tim Park, can you give an example of a time you applied a philosopher's work in your life? Do it all the time, pretty much every day. You want to pick philosophers who actually are applicable. But I'll tell you about something I've been doing. I've been writing blog entries for my son, who is struggling with some of the same kind of anger management issues as I did at his age. And, we've been looking at this week Aristotle's definition of anger from the Rhetoric, Book 2, and breaking it down and talking about how it applies to, particular situations that he finds himself in, and where he can take a pause and where he can think about something. And, that's just one example out of so many. I use the stuff that I'm working on all the time, and I do it with clients. That's why I do philosophical counseling. That's what philosophical counseling is. So yeah. Let's see. 3 minutes before I gotta get out of here, and I actually have to go see a client today, and take care of that. Let's see. Here's a good one. Do I think Socrates was a troll? What were his intentions? No, I don't think he was a troll. I think if he was a troll, it would be with the kind of people who only deserve trolls, who are usually trolls themselves, right? And Mrs. writes, trolling for reason and truth. There is no such thing. Trolling is trolling. It's just a puerile, low-level sort of activity. If you're actually trying to provoke people to think, you're not just trolling. I think a lot of the time Socrates gives arguments that are not particularly good arguments, and he does that with people who are not not capable of grasping the flaws with those arguments. But then we can look at it and we can be like, yeah, this should have been answered here, and this should have been addressed here. So a lot of it is to try to provoke thinking on our own part. And remember, Plato thought that writing was not as good as back and forth dialogue, right? So he's trying to write in such a way as to produce a possibility of dialogue, not just within the text, but us with the text. That's something that's key to Plato's writing. And so Socrates is used as a character to help promote that. Let's see here. Ken Roberts, can it be argued the continental analytic philosophy split started with Kant and is an epistemology? No. The analytic continental philosophy split began with the analytics actually emerging as a movement, and then it was consolidated by the analytics managing to take over and capture much of the discourse within the Anglosphere. That's a purely 20th century phenomenon. And I don't know that it'll remain, down the line in the future, because unless you can actually show that philosophy has application to life, and both analytic and continental philosophers often have immense troubles with that, there's not going to be a hell of a lot of public support for it, and I'm fine with that, quite frankly. All right, we got about a minute left. Let's see who we've got. A lot of back and forth arguing about Trump here. Let's see who else we've got. Let's got something easy to knock out. Somebody asking about Peterson. Already answered enough. All right. Interesting question here. Dr. Sadler, thinking of going to grad school for philosophy and psychology. Can you talk about how the culture in a Midwest college is different from an East Coast college? It's not. Academics are academics. And people in the Midwest who are academics often have a kind of inferiority complex, wish that I was them attitude towards people from the East Coast. There's sort of an emulation of the Ivies, right? That is very common, down to like mannerisms and the word choices that they make. And so I think, academic places often tend to be kind of oases in the middle of, a larger culture. And it depends on where you're talking about in the Midwest. Some people think that Kansas is Midwest. I'd actually say that's the Plains. I think of the Midwest as, on the western side, you've got Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, but it's, once you start getting past Effingham, it's no longer Midwest. It's definitely South. Wisconsin is right in the middle of the Midwest. Michigan, Indiana, although shave off the southern tip, and then Ohio. And that's pretty much the Midwest as far as culture goes. And parts of it are very different from other parts. So I don't think there's going to be a hell of a lot of difference in the academic culture. A lot of it's going to depend on, what sort of level of tier that school is. And a lot of the academics in Midwestern colleges and universities are going to be from the East Coast because they churn out all these people who then we hire because we think, oh, it's so wonderful to have somebody from the Ivies, and we don't pay any attention to whether they intend to stay or whether they're any good. We rely on pedigree too much and reputation rather than actually looking at the candidates. So, I don't think you're going to see a hell of a lot of difference between the two. All right, so I am going to call it to a close now. It's 1:32. I got to get ready to meet my client here locally in Milwaukee. Thanks for all the questions. I didn't get to everything, but I never do. You want to get your questions in early on. And if I don't see you for any other online events, hope you have a great holidays season, whatever your holidays happen to be. I know I'm going to enjoy going to quite a few of them. And I have a holiday party to go to tonight for the Marquette Philosophy Department. I won't be doing any heavy drinking or anything like that, but certainly will enjoy meeting with my colleagues. I'm bringing some roasted root vegetables since it's a potluck. So, all right, I will be having some other online events this month, so you can stay tuned for those, and I'll see you when I see you.